It was supposed to be just another late drive home. Nothing special, nothing strange. Jack Reynolds, a 38-year-old mechanic from the sleepy, half-forgotten town of Stanton, Montana, had just wrapped up a grueling 12-hour shift at Bauer's Auto Shop, the kind of place with flickering fluorescent lights and the perpetual smell of oil and rust in the air. That night, he'd stayed later than usual to help a stranded father of three who needed his beat-up Ford pickup running by morning. Jack didn't complain. He never did. It was just in his nature to help. Around midnight, he finally packed up his tools, wiped the grease from his hands, and stepped into the cold embrace of the Montana night. The air was razor-sharp, dry, and still. His breath steamed out in short bursts as he walked his old Chevy truck, the only vehicle left in the crack lot. He climbed in, started the engine, and began the long drive down Highway 89. The road was as empty as ever, miles and miles of cracked asphalt cutting through dense forest, with no gas stations, no houses, and certainly no cell signal. This stretch of highway had always had a reputation, not for accidents, but for absence. People said it felt like stepping into a place the world forgot. Jack didn't mind. He liked the isolation. It gave him space to breathe, to process the day, to let his thoughts wander in peace. No honking. No headlights in the rear view, just a rhythmic hum of tires rolling across the worn pavement, the occasional creak of a suspension, and the darkness outside pressing against the windows like a living thing. On any other night, it would have been relaxing, but not this one. There was something wrong with the silence tonight. Something off. It wasn't just quiet. It was too quiet. No wind, no rustling branches, no distant owls. Just stillness. That's when he saw it. At first, it was just a glimmer, a faint glow peeking over the tops of the pine trees. Jack squinted, slowing his truck to a crawl. The light grew brighter, more defined, until it hovered in full view just above the treetops, unmoving, pulsing gently like it had a rhythm of its own. He rolled down his window to get a better look. The cold bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. His eyes were locked on the object. It didn't sway like a helicopter fighting the wind, nor did it dart like a drone. It stayed perfectly still. Too still. The light wasn't flickering. It was breathing, expanding and contracting in perfect cadence, like a heartbeat made of electricity. Jack's stomach turned with a sensation he hadn't felt since he was a child. The deep, unmistakable sense that he was being watched by something not of this world. Curiosity edged out caution, and Jack eased his foot off the gas, guiding his truck onto gravel's shoulder with a crunch that echoed unnaturally loud in the stillness. He turned off the engine, and the sudden silence felt like a vacuum, the kind of quiet that doesn't just settle around you, it presses in. He opened the driver's side door slowly, the creak of the hinges cutting through the air like a warning he didn't yet understand. Stepping out, the freezing air wrapped around him like ice water. He could feel it bite through his jacket, needle into his skin, but his attention was locked on the light above. It hadn't moved, not an inch. It hovered with eerie patience, pulsing gently as though alive. Jack, still holding on to some thread of logic, reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. He opened the camera, lifted it toward the sky, but as soon as he aimed, the screen went black. No glitch, no fade, just dead. He frowned, confused, and pressed the power button. Nothing. No response. His battery had been at 82% just 10 minutes earlier. He tried again. Still dead. The light continued pulsing, steady, calm, watching. Then he noticed something else. A different kind of silence. Not just quiet, but wrong. There were no sounds at all. No chirping crickets. No distant howl of coyotes. Not even the subtle groan of tree branches in the wind. Everything was still. Oppressively still. It felt like the entire forest had been frozen in time. Jack slowly turned in a circle, scanning the tree line, suddenly aware of how exposed he was. Then, without any signal, without a gust of wind or tremor in the earth, the light moved. Not in a natural way, not like anything human-made. It didn't sway, it didn't wobble. It shifted downward, smooth, exact, unerringly controlled. It moved like something that had studied motion, not grown into it. Jack's body tensed as the object descended, the air around him thickening with an invisible weight. His ears popped. His breath felt heavier. It was like the atmosphere was slowly turning into water, and he was trying to breathe through it. Panic exploded in his chest. He sprinted back to his truck, heart hammering like a jackhammer in his ribs, and dove into the driver's seat. He slammed the door shut, locked it instinctively, and jammed the key into the ignition. He turned it hard. Nothing. No click. No sputter. Not even the familiar whine of a struggling starter. He tried again, same result. A third time, still nothing. The dashboard lights were dead. The stereo was dark. The headlights wouldn't even twitch. It was like the entire vehicle had been unplugged from reality. Jack slapped the steering wheel in frustration, glancing up through the windshield. The light was closer now. Too close. He could feel its presence inside the cabin, like it was leaking into the glass, pressing against his thoughts. The hair on his arms stood up, his skin buzzed with static. Something wasn't just watching him. It was reaching for him, not with hands, but with an unseen force that felt like it was peeling back the layers of his mind, examining what was underneath. That's when he saw it. At first, it was nothing more than a soft glimmer, barely noticeable, just a faint glow peeking over the jagged tops of the pine trees lining the road like a living wall. Jack blinked, thinking it might have been a reflection of his dashboard lights, or maybe the moon breaking through the clouds. But it wasn't the moon. There were no clouds. The sky was crystal clear, peppered with stars that had watched over the road for millions of years. And none of them looked like that. He squinted, instinctively lifting his foot off the gas pedal as the truck began to slow. His eyes strained to make sense of what he was seeing. The glow intensified. It wasn't just getting brighter. It was becoming more defined. What began as a shimmer was now a radiant orb, suspended above the treetops with deliberate stillness. It didn't shift. It didn't flicker. It just was. Jack's breathing slowed as he guided his truck to a crawl, tires crunching softly against the edge of the gravel shoulder, drawn in like prey by some unseen instinct. He reached for the window crank. His old Chevy still had manual ones, and rolled it down slowly, the cold night air flooding the cabin like a tidal wave. It bit at his face and hands, stung his lungs as he inhaled, but he barely noticed. His gaze was fixed upward, locked on the thing in the sky. The light didn't behave like anything he'd ever seen. It wasn't the erratic strobe of a drone. It didn't pivot like a helicopter buffeted by crosswinds. It was perfectly motionless, unnaturally so, a kind of stillness that made your brain itch. Jack had grown up hunting in these woods. He knew how birds hovered, how aircraft drifted, how even stars seemed to shimmer. This didn't. The object emitted a glow that wasn't harsh like a spotlight, but organic, warm, almost soft. Yet somehow, it was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. It pulsed in and out, expanding and contracting with a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat. Not random, not artificial. Alive. As the seconds dragged on, Jack became aware of something else, something far more unsettling than the sight itself. He was being watched. Not the way a passerby glances at you on the street. No, this was different. It was primal, ancient, like the sensation of a predator sizing up its prey from just beyond the tree line. The light in the sky wasn't just visible. It was aware. He could feel it, not through logic or reason, but something deeper. The way a dog knows a storm is coming. The way you wake up seconds before a nightmare crashes into you. His hands, which had been resting loosely on the steering wheel, were now gripping it tightly, knuckles white. His stomach twisted, coiled up in a cold, heavy knot. Memories flickered in his mind. Being 5 years old, lost in the woods at dusk, that same feeling of being surrounded by something he couldn't see. But that saw him. He hadn't felt it in decades. Until now. Still, he couldn't look away. The object remained completely still, hovering just above the treetops, its light breathing in tandem with something invisible and enormous. It wasn't just emitting light. It was interacting with the space around it. Shadows from the trees warp in ways that didn't make sense. The edges of Jack's vision seemed to ripple, like heat waves rising off asphalt. And for a brief, terrifying moment, he thought he could hear something. Not sound exactly, but a low vibration, like a deep hum buried beneath the threshold of hearing, brushing up against his thoughts rather than his ears. He wasn't sure if it was real, or if his brain was just trying to fill in the blanks. But one thing was certain. Whatever this was, it didn't belong to the world he knew. And the longer he stared, the more convinced he became that it wasn't here by accident. It had chosen to be here, chosen to be seen, and chosen him. Jack's breath caught in his throat as that realization crystallized in his mind. It knows I'm here. He wasn't just a passerby stumbling upon a strange light in the sky. He was part of this. Somehow, in ways he couldn't explain, the object had noticed him the same way he had noticed it. That pulsing glow, calm, calculated, and far too intelligent, was no accident. It wasn't a flare. It wasn't a weather balloon. This was something observing, analyzing, and now communicating in a language far beyond human comprehension. Jack could feel his heartbeat syncing with the rhythm of the pulses, a terrifying, involuntary connection that tightened around his chest like an invisible vice. He wanted to back away, to turn the key and drive, but his body didn't respond. It was as if something in the air had changed, grown thicker, denser, harder to move through. Time itself seemed to slow, stretching each second into an eternity. His eyes started to water, not from fear, but from the intensity of the light. It was subtle at first, then overwhelming, as if his brain couldn't process the colors it was seeing. There were shades that had no name, geometries in the light patterns that bent and twisted like they were folding space itself. The object wasn't just a source of light. It was distorting the environment around it. The air shimmered like a heat mirage, but the temperature had dropped. Jack could see his breath, slow and heavy, fogging up in the freezing night as the object began to lower, inch by inch, still perfectly silent, as if gravity didn't apply. That silence deepened, stretched unnaturally wide, until even Jack's own heartbeat sounded muffled in his ears. The world had become a vacuum, a waiting room for something unimaginable. And then the pressure came. It wasn't physical, not exactly. It didn't press against his skin like weight. It was internal, as if something vast and foreign was tuning into the frequency of his mind. A presence, ancient, cold, and impossibly intelligent, brushed against his consciousness like fingers on glass. Images began to flicker behind his eyes, not visions, but impressions. Symbols, numbers, memories that weren't his. A family he didn't recognize. A planet with 2 suns. A structure made of shifting light. None of it made sense, and yet it all felt familiar, like forgotten dreams resurfacing after years submerged. Jack wanted to scream, but even that was taken from him. His body was frozen, paralyzed, not from fear, but by something external. His fingers wouldn't move. His jaw was locked tight. The only part of him still alive was his mind, which now felt like an open book being read by something watching from just beyond the edge of human perception. He didn't know how long he sat like that, trapped in that eternal moment. Maybe seconds, maybe hours. Time had ceased to matter. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, it stopped. The pressure vanished. The paralysis lifted like a snapped thread. Jack inhaled sharply, coughing as air rushed back into his lungs. He blinked hard, eyes stinging, and looked up. The light had retracted, as if startled by its own closeness, pulling upward with impossible speed and grace. In less than a second, it was a dot in the sky, then gone. No sound, no trail, nothing but the empty road, the dark pines, and a silence that now felt normal again but tainted. His truck dashboard flickered to life without a key. The headlights blinked on. His phone, still in his lap, powered back up as if nothing had happened. Jack sat there in stunned silence, his body trembling, as the echo of that presence lingered somewhere deep inside him like a fingerprint burned into his soul. Jack sat motionless behind the wheel, eyes wide and unfocused, heart still racing even as the night returned to its ordinary shape around him. The trees swayed again. The insects resumed their chorus. The wind whispered through the pines like nothing had ever disturbed it. But Jack knew better. Something had changed, outside of him and within. He could feel it like a splinter in the back of his mind. A residue, a presence that hadn't fully left. The radio crackled to life suddenly, not with music, but static, low and warbling, as if it had traveled light years to reach him. Then a sharp pop and silence again. Jack's eyes darted to the display. The time read 3:13 a.m. He hadn't noticed the hours pass. Slowly, hands shaking, he turned the key in the ignition. The truck rumbled to life like normal. No warning lights. No sign of malfunction. But that only made things worse. Everything was too normal now. Perfectly clean. Like reality had reset itself. Trying to pretend nothing out of the ordinary had ever occurred. He pulled back onto the road and drove in silence, headlights slicing through the darkness. He didn't turn on the radio, didn't glance at his phone. He just drove, mile after mile, trying not to think. But thoughts came anyway. Not his own. Ideas, fragments of language that felt implanted. Words he didn't recognize but somehow understood. Equations danced behind his eyelids when he blinked. Glimpses of cities suspended in clouds. Creatures with long, graceful limbs and soundscapes that pulsed like emotion. He shook his head, trying to force them out, but they clung to him like fog. As he reached the outskirts of town, he slowed down. Everything looked the same. His neighbor's mailbox still leaning, the diner still dark at this hour, the streetlights blinking like always. But the moment he pulled into his driveway and shut off the engine, a wave of nausea hit him. Not from sickness, from recognition. There on the side of his garage, something caught the light, a faint pattern, almost invisible unless you looked straight at it. A symbol, circular, delicate, etched into the paint like it had been burned there with heat and precision. It hadn't been there before. He knew that. He stepped out of the truck, legs unsteady, and approached it slowly. His breath fogged the air again. The closer he got, the more the shape shimmered, like it was moving slightly beneath the surface. It wasn't just a mark. It was a signature, a calling card, proof. But proof of what? That he'd been chosen? That he'd been altered? He reached out, fingertips trembling, but didn't touch it. He couldn't. Deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Whatever had found him out there hadn't finished. This was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Jack didn't tell anyone. Not about the light. Not about the mark. Not about the dreams. Because the dreams had started immediately, vivid, detailed, and terrifyingly consistent. In every one, he stood in a field beneath twin suns. In every one, the sky opened. In every one, something came through. He began to draw symbols in his sleep. Wake up standing in the yard with no memory of how he got there. Electronic devices around him would glitch when he got too close. Animals acted strangely. Dogs barking at empty corners. Birds fleeing the trees when he passed. He felt it constantly now, the way one feels a storm building miles off, pressure in the air, a distant humming in the bones. And then one morning, he awoke at exactly 3:13 a.m. Again, this time there was something waiting. Not outside, inside. His house was completely dark, yet somehow filled with the glow of that same impossible light. He stood, eyes wide, the symbols from his dreams now carved into the walls around him. Not drawn, carved. The message was clear. They had opened a door, not just in space, in him, and they would be back, not to observe, not to study, but to collect. Jack's last conscious thought as the room began to pulse was this: I wasn't chosen at random. I was prepared. And then he was gone.